It says we are preparing to live stream. Sometimes it says that, but we're already live. So we'll see. Here we go. All right. Looks like we are live. I just want to welcome everyone to Coffee, Coaching, and Callings, a live podcast created for coaches, leaders, and helping professionals who are on a mission to lead a successful and heart-centered life. I'm your host today, Laurel Elders, with the Institute for Integrative Intelligence, where it's our mission to elevate human potential through both the art and the science of masterful coaching. I'm so excited because today I have with me Alli O'Malley, the author of More Than a Crime, a memoir of Alli's mission of hope in the shadow of domestic violence. Welcome, Alli.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Finally, I've actually been wanting to interview for you for years. So when your book came out, I'm like, that's it, we're doing it. We're getting it on the calendar.
Oh, that's great.
So I just wanted to share before we dive in that I've invited Alli to the podcast because I love interviewing true pioneers who provide really key thought leadership and fresh new insights to a world that really needs them. And Alli is doing just that in the work that she's bringing forward. I met Alli in 2021 and was immediately impressed by her very much needed perspective and message surrounding domestic abuse, healing, and empowerment, and how she was fostering some pretty impactful change. So we get to explore all of this today directly with Alli. And I just want to add that today's exploration is going to be really pivotal for therapists, clergy, coaches, healthcare workers, lawyers in family law, and anyone who's been impacted or who is impacted currently by domestic violence. So, Alli, let's dive in. I'm wondering if you could just kick us off by sharing a little bit more about your background and what really brought you into this important work.
Sure. I think I just want to add to that even lawyers who are involved in criminal law may be interested in this
Yeah.
topic as well, not just family. Um, so, my background is for 12 years from 2008 to 2020, I ran a small transitional domestic violence program in upstate New York, outside of Rochester, New York, called Resolve of Greater Rochester. And I was brought to that work because I lived with intimate partner violence as a child in my family home and then married into it at a young age. And was really blessed to meet a wonderful partner to whom I'm still married now for 28 years. Um, and through that relationship and my own commitment to healing and growing, I found myself wanting to get involved as a volunteer and help other women who had been impacted by domestic violence. And I was really surprised when I went looking for um, organizations, and I was inquiring about their approaches to the work, and I just didn't find anywhere the approach that I had taken. And not that my approach was the right approach, it was the right approach for me. But I was concerned at what I was hearing in how organizations were approaching the work. And so I started volunteering and ended up really leading a speakers bureau. Um, and in that capacity, I learned that my story could help people
Mm.
and really reached people. And people would often tell me, I've never heard anybody talk about domestic violence the way you do. I feel seen, I feel heard, and I want to know more. And I ended up running that organization that I started as a volunteer. Um, and we really revamped how we approached the work and created something really special, I guess is the
Yeah.
way that I want to phrase it. And we ended up serving around 400 women a year. We did serve all people, so it wasn't just women. We served men who were victimized. we worked with LGBTQ populations. So it wasn't only women in heterosexual relationships that we worked with. Um, it was a transitional program. It was not a shelter. I think shelters are very important in domestic violence work, but they're not the answer for every person. And often the opportunity in shelter is for real crisis intervention, but there isn't enough time or access to the survivor to help them really heal and rebuild. So I think that the two functions are very important, but they serve a different requirement.
Mm.
Um, so we focused on the transitional approach to addressing domestic violence. So you've had this horrible thing happen to you. You may be still in the middle of it. You may be thinking about what you want to do about it. You may have already left, but still feel bound and constricted by your experience. Sometimes people have been out of this situation for years and they just feel like they can't move forward. And there wasn't any place for them to go, or they didn't feel like there was any place for them to go. And so we were available to you no matter where you were on that continuum. And we really were able to reach people and invite them into recognizing how strong and capable and beautiful and deserving they were of a life better than the one that they were experiencing at the moment.
Uh, that just, it's so inspiring, Allie, because one of the things that struck me about your work and perspective is just to piggyback off of what you just shared, it's your approach really isn't let's, it's not just let's stop the bleeding. It's let's stop the bleeding, but also let's heal the wound. But then you don't stop
Mhm.
there. It's not just let's heal the wound, it's let's help you find your power. And some programs might only address maybe one or two of those elements, and you're like, it's all of it, right?
Yeah.
That integrative intelligence piece. Let's look at the whole picture and bring in that other piece. What inspired you to go beyond, past thinking in this area?
Um, I guess I didn't take a traditional path out of my own experience. And so, um, you know, as I describe in the book, because I grew up in a home that featured violence and abuse, I didn't really know what life could be without it. So it was
Mm.
very normal to me. And I didn't recognize that what I was dealing with was violence and abuse in my first marriage because it was really all I'd ever known. And so I found my way into therapy, and I was really blessed to A, find a social worker. She was trained in social work who recognized violence and abuse. It's pretty shocking to people to hear that the vast majority of social work programs don't even include curriculum content on how to work with survivors of violence and abuse.
Yeah, I
There
was
are
surprised
very,
when you shared that.
yeah, very, very few curriculums really focus on that. They might touch on it for, part of a semester somewhere along the training, but it is not a focal point. Um, so I was very lucky to have found someone who understood violence and abuse and its effect on people. And so even though I did not have a substance abuse problem, she had trained for years in substance abuse and then went into private practice. And there are just a lot of parallels. Whether you are somebody dealing with addiction yourself, who then finds yourself in an abusive relationship, or you are on the receiving end of abuse and you can't find your way out of that. Even though, much like an addict, you sense that something isn't right, or you want something different from yourself, but you can't detach. Um, I see just a lot of parallels in that work. And fortunately, I found someone who understood that. Um, and my former partner um, did drink, but wasn't an alcoholic, but he did drink. Um, so it was helpful. because she was able to help me kind of figure those things out. But I already knew, uh, because I knew my partner well, that they weren't necessarily worse when they were drinking. It was harder to argue with them when they were drinking
Mhm.
because you couldn't reach them. But many survivors will say they're only bad when they're drunk, or they're only bad when they're using drugs, right? I didn't have that experience. I felt the controlling behavior 100% of the time, and then it was kind of worse when substances were in the mix. Um, so I entered therapy with a perception that there was something very, very wrong with me. And I wanted to feel better. I wanted to feel better. And then during the course of therapy, I learned that what I was living with was abuse. And it was very, very eye-opening for me. Like
Mm.
that question, do you know that's abuse? Which I share in the book, came at around the third session. And it was immediately I wanted to deflect. I wanted to say, no, 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 don't you, my inner voice was screaming, don't you see how strong I am? How I would never put up with that. Um,
Can I pause
and
you really quickly? I
yeah,
want to add
uh-huh,
that, and this is something that you and I spoke about, and I think it's so impressive. Impressive is that in the book you highlight you were living this amazing, successful, outward-facing life,
mhm,
right?
mhm,
So it's
yeah,
not, yeah. I want to highlight that because that's,
yeah.
yeah.
Oh, but I was young. I was also young.
Hmm.
Um, we married when I was 19, and I found my way into therapy about the time I was 22, 23.
Hmm.
Um, and so, yes, but that's a very important point, I think. There was this incongruence in my life. I had places in my life where I had positive, affirming relationships,
Hmm.
and I had my marriage, and um, they didn't go together. And so I think that's part of why I felt this conflict internally.
Yeah.
And so, I went into therapy wanting to feel more congruent in my life. Um, and so that was what I went searching for. And in the process, I uncovered that I had lived with abuse. Much of my identity was shaped by abusive men in my case. Um, and I wanted something better. I just wanted something better for myself. And so that was my journey, where a lot of domestic violence survivors show up at the door of a domestic violence program, and everybody says, here's the problem in this little box, domestic violence, and you're going to do this, this, and this, and you're going to be better, or you're going to get out, or whatever that organization's answer to domestic violence is. So I think in some ways, because I didn't know what I was dealing with, I was able to go into therapy and define my path forward.
Mm.
So when I ended up running an organization that was serving survivors of domestic violence, I didn't I didn't have a prescription for them that said, this is your path forward. I said, and our team developed an intervention where we said, when you walk through our door, we recognize that you are here because you want something for yourself. You get to define the something. We help you figure out how to get there.
Mm. That's beautiful.
Um, yeah, and it at the time I only hired, because I was such a fan of the social worker who I worked with. At the time, I
Mhm.
only I only hired, clinically trained social workers, particularly those with backgrounds in trauma. Um, and I didn't recognize at the time that our approach was very coaching oriented in
Mm.
kind of how we went about doing the work we do. And then when I met you in 2021 and participated in your coaching program, it was amazing to me how the tenets of coaching
Mm.
were so fundamental to how we approach the work that we did.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so fascinating. And I know in the book you also shared about the study of, basically how effective the approach was found to be with Dr. Was it Trebold?
Traybold, yeah.
Traybold. Okay.
Dr. Traybold, yeah,
Yeah.
Nicole Traybold. Yes, we did do a formal study, and we had hoped to do multiple formal studies, but we did complete one. And the the approach that we used in addressing violence and abuse was defined as a promising practice in a peer-reviewed journal. And our vision was not how do we drive more people into our door, but how do we teach more people to do this work the way that we do it so that we could make it more generally available.
Mm,
And that was the original vision.
nice.
Mhm.
Would you share a little bit more about some of the findings that anything surprise you about the findings or?
Um, well, the whole process was very interesting. The clients, it was not a huge study, it was a fairly small study, but we worked with clients who had been with us 3 years prior, 1 year prior, and 2 years prior. So the first piece of information that was really fascinating to us as we did this evaluation was we were able to find women who were 3 years out from our program. So I just want to back up for 1 second. This was defined as a short-term intervention. Typically, clients would see us between 10 and 15 times. And then at the end of that, we would refer to another provider, or they would choose to go on, with what they'd learned and just, decide what they wanted to do. So, and a lot of people at the beginning were like, you're not going to fix domestic violence in 10 sessions. But we didn't set out to fix domestic violence.
Mhm.
We set out to serve survivors of domestic violence in finding their way forward, whatever that way forward looked like for them. And it's remarkable what you can do in 15 sessions when you are inviting a person into their own answers and then helping them problem solve how to go about achieving those answers. Um, so the first finding was that we were able to find women 3 years out from the program. And what that was an indication of was their stability. And many, many survivors of domestic violence often struggle for years post the end of the relationship with just finding stability. And we were really stunned that we could find, you know, a bunch of women who were 3 years out from the program. They were stable and they were doing very, very well. Um, Many of the clients in the study reported feeling seen. They just said this intervention is different. The environment was different. It was warm, it was welcoming, and I just felt seen and I felt heard. And what that speaks to is just that it wasn't our agenda, it
Mm,
was their agenda. And you can be present to someone when you are open to them leading,
mm,
right? Um, and I think also from a practitioner perspective, doing this work as a practitioner in whatever your discipline is really, it's hard. I mean, you hear absolutely horrible stories every single day, but we aren't focused on looking back. If a client wants to talk about a specific experience or multiple experiences, and that's what they need to do as part of their healing journey, they can. But again, we didn't need to have that information in order to help them find a path forward for themselves.
mm. Wow.
And so that was really the focus of the intervention is what does life post violence and abuse look like for you, and how do we help you get there?
Right. That and that empowerment piece.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Nice.
Yep.
The other thing that stood out to me in the book was how you really shared that intimate partner. Well, once you've reframed it to intimate partner violence, which I
Mm-hmm.
thought was really helpful, get to more of what was happening, but also that it's the violence isn't necessarily natural.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the behavior is often born of shame and trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Mm-hmm.
that really speaks to the roots, but also something that really impressed me when we were talking back in 2021 was like everyone is a human being in this dynamic, including the person who is being violent.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Can you share a little bit
So
more about
yeah,
your
let's
humanity?
talk about language, the language a little bit, because I think the
Yeah.
language around this issue is really part of what limits us is
Mhm.
the language that we use. So first of all, I rarely use the term victim as a noun when I'm talking about domestic violence. I believe people have been victimized. It's a verb, right? It's
Mhm.
happened to you. But if you hang that definition around your neck and you define yourself as a victim, you have put yourself, many people put themselves in a hole that is remarkably hard to climb out of. So I believe that anybody who has lived with an abusive or violent partner is a survivor immediately. And I think that that's one of the values that our organization carried and that I carry around this work is that to survive living with an abusive or violent partner, survival isn't past tense. You know, surviving is in many ways the opposite of living, right? When we are surviving, we're just getting by.
Mhm.
We're not living. And that's what the experience of living with violence and abuse is about. It takes inordinate strength to just get through every single day, no matter what your circumstances. If you are living in poverty and you're dealing with violence and abuse in your home, it's inordinately hard. If you are middle class and you have a job and you go home to violence and abuse every day, the challenge of enduring that in your home, which is supposed to be a safe and secure place, is remarkably different
Yeah.
and difficult. If you're affluent and you have a partner who is abusing you, uh, it's it the the games that that plays in your head, it's just so hard to make sense of it. And so you never can live when violence and abuse is present. It's like this cloud that we live under. So I think that everyone who endures that kind of relationship is a survivor.
Mm.
And surviving to me is not the goal. We want to get to a place where we can live and we can thrive. So, what is that next term? So a lot of people say victims, going from victim to survivor to thriver. That could be. I do believe that thriving is what all of us ultimately want in our lives. That's what makes life worth living, is when we are thriving, which requires us to be thriving in many domains of our life.
Mm.
Few of us are thriving in all domains at all times, right? But at least the majority of our domains, we want to feel like we are
Mhm.
thriving in. Um, for some people, the right language is victor. Like you are victorious over this experience. And how does that language sit with you? So languaging domestic violence when you're on the receiving end of it is really challenging, and it it it's worth spending the time sorting that out with someone.
Mm.
And then the other thing is, we the term victim and the term perpetrator come from the criminal justice system. Those are criminal justice terms, um, and they're really important in criminal justice.
Mhm.
Many domestic violence couples embroiled in domestic violence never ever participate at all in the criminal justice system, which is why I call the book More Than a Crime.
Mm.
And so there's broader language even for those who commit violence. And I prefer the term offender, the person who is behaving offensively or offending another person. Um, and that's not I'm thinking of George Carlin, who used to say we used to like try to language things and soften them. That's not to soften the experience of the survivor, but it invites us to think about the offender as also still being a human being.
Yeah.
Um, we have, you know, in issues of violence against women, we tend to, when we think about rape, for example, we think of the man, we teach kids to be wary of the man in the raincoat in the bushes, right? When we know that the majority of the time that's not the one, the stranger is not the one who commits rape. It's somebody that you know, it's somebody who's close to you, it's date rape, it's a family member. These are the really uncomfortable truths about violence against women. And when you're experiencing violence from somebody who claims to love you, that in of itself is just very challenging for you to unpack
Yeah.
and to recognize. So, and I do believe that the majority of offenders, it's certainly not every offender. There are some offenders who truly are violent people who get some kick out of the violence. But the majority of offenders are really broken humans who don't have any other tools.
Mm.
Um,
Right. They don't
and
wake up saying, I want to be this. It just,
no,
yeah.
no.
Yeah.
And they learn over time. Maybe they learn from watching a parent be violent and abusive and get their way, that that's a good way to get your way.
Mhm.
Um, Maybe when when they're saying, I love you so much, you make me do these things to you, which is a very common kind of line of language in an abusive relationship. Why did you make me do this to you? Um, you know, we can never make another person do anything.
Yeah.
If you're a parent, you know that firsthand. How many of us have tried to parent a kid to do something in particular and that
Yeah.
kid doesn't choose to do it? So the same is true in an intimate relationship. Um, and I also want to say that offenders need to take responsibility for their behavior. There needs to be accountability for their behavior. And it is never going to be the survivor's responsibility
Mm.
to hold the offender accountable because they can't. They may really, really want to, um, but unless that offender is actually committing to changing their behavior and doing their own work,
Mhm.
it's never something that you on the receiving end of violence are going to be able to police that other person into.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and I can personally relate to that. And in my own personal experience, it's like, oh, if I only do this differently, or if I say this differently, or if I, just have a little bit more compassion, and instead of realizing that it's not about what I do.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I used to believe that, if I could only love him as much as he loves me, then maybe I can, maybe it'll be okay.
Yeah.
Took a long time for me to realize that there was not going to be there was nothing I could do.
Yeah.
And that conflict that I felt, the fear that I had developed over time was really for the lack of a better word, the right feeling. That was the part of me that was about I actually have to preserve my life and my sanctity
Mhm.
with this person, and that can't be love. Right.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
um, they might say that it is, but the reality is that's never what love looks like.
Yeah. Yeah. So true. And, I'm even thinking back to, we had some bigger picture um, conversations too. And then in your book, you talk about some of the statistics because there was this research showed that there was a correlation, highly correlated, with urgent social concerns and
Hmm.
violence in the house or intimate partner violence. So some of
Yep.
those named unplanned pregnancy, abortion, homelessness for women and children, substance abuse, poverty, child neglect or abuse, sex trafficking, murder and suicide, and mass shootings. Like,
Yeah,
so I think that really, to me, showcases some of how brokenness can play out. I'm
absolutely.
curious your thoughts on that.
Yes. So this is a personal passion of mine.
Mm,
Another reason that I chose the title that I did for the book. Um, you know, domestic violence, the original term, was coined from an important place in the 1960s and 70s in recognition of the fact that women were not property that could be treated, as a slave would have been treated. Um, and yet that was what was happening.
mhm,
And so it was essential that we bring to light the realities of violence and abuse in a home. Um, and the with that term, there was also, and when my parents were going through divorce in the early 70s, um, women were automatically considered to be the mother, right? And should get custody just because they're the mother. Um, and men and the violence was considered to be a private matter.
mm,
And as much as we have made progress, we can have conversations about violence in public now. We acknowledge the frequency and the commonality of domestic violence in the home. Um, there are still heavy shadows of
mm,
it being a private matter, of being something that you need to keep a secret. I think that's why so many survivors feel so much shame. It's this history of, uh, domestic violence is a private matter and you don't talk about it and you don't tell.
mm.
Um, sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought there. Your question, can you repeat your question and I can get back to it? Oh, the correlations between other challenges in society.
Yeah.
So, very rarely do we hear during a mass shooting. We actually, when you listen to the story and the way it's reported, we often hear before this person went and shot up 5 or 6 people at this club or what have you, they shot their mother or they shot their spouse, right? It's very, very common that the news reporting will even include that detail, but they won't assign the word domestic violence. This started as a domestic violence incident and then went outside the home. Um, we watch Dateline and you watch any of those kind of 2020 programs, and you see so many stories about love triangles and this, that, and the other. And it's glorified domestic violence.
Mm,
Um, and we just skip that part. We skip over the reality that something wasn't right in that home, in that family. And then the perpetrator took it outside of the home. It spilled over in one way or another. Um, Almost all domestic violence, homicide, and suicides. So one person kills the other person, then takes their own life. That's almost always domestic violence.
mm.
Um, and it's not labeled that way. Um,
Like there was a
and
systemic issue of
yeah,
domestic violence going, yeah, that led up
yeah, it's
to, yeah,
everywhere.
yeah.
And when children don't feel secure in their home growing up, what are the consequences of that going forward? And, our child protective system doesn't do a great job navigating violence in the home. And, our family court system doesn't really acknowledge violence and abuse in the home. it's many years behind in the research in terms of what's
Mhm.
best for children when there's violence and abuse in the home. There's still a strong pull in family court to make sure that children have access to both parents, even when one parent is a risk.
Mm.
Um, and the protective parents' concerns are often dismissed and considered to be petty or being done just to cause harm to the other person,
Right.
and not recognized as being protective.
Yeah. I've
So,
seen that happen.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and it is important to note that domestic violence is the number one cause of homelessness for women and children.
Wow.
So, number one. Um, yeah, and that also is fascinating.
Mhm.
Why is it that the offender isn't put out of the home? You
Mm.
know, why is it that the person who's being victimized and their children are the ones who get displaced, you know?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so there's still just a lot of work to do to acknowledge that, life is hard.
Mhm.
Life is hard. And, even in great relationships, if you're having a bad day and you have a wonderful partner, when you get home, that wonderful partner often is the recipient of your bad mood. Right? And they're just, if they're a good partner, they recognize that this is a moment and it will pass, or they can call you on it and say, what's going on right now? I didn't cause this problem. Can we can we
Mhm.
voice what's happening here and resolve it? But in an abusive relationship, the person on the receiving end of the abuse is blamed for everything bad that goes on in the other person's life.
Mm.
And it's, that is power. That's one person exerting power over the other person and then kind of flipping it. So let me explain that. So my ex-husband, and very much my father too, taught me that I was responsible for their happiness. Um,
Mm.
And so how is that control, right? That's very controlling and manipulative because it says, I'm not responsible for my happiness. You're responsible for my happiness, which makes, so it relieves them of all responsibility of taking care of themselves and it puts it on the other partner. And that is a form of coercive control. And it's really damaging, really, really damaging over time.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that I feel like looking back was, I think maybe a wisdom gained. I know we talked about from the weeds to wisdom, like what wisdoms were gained. And I looked at people's experiences and my own experience. I'm like, wow, each of our human virtues that we have embedded within us, such as compassion, can turn into a liability if
Mhm.
I position myself as I just wasn't compassionate enough. I needed to be more supportive instead of having a healthy internal boundary of something's wrong, something's
Mhm,
off,
mhm,
and
mhm.
having that take your power back piece.
Yeah. I was very young when I entered into that, the relationship with the man that I married at 19. So
Mhm.
I met him when I was 16 and a half, probably. Um, and I love to go out and talk to young people because our early relationships are so formative. We kind of learn how to be in relationship in those early dating relationships. And if you have a partner who doesn't treat you very well, it can really set you up for problems um,
Mhm.
down the road. And so one of the things that I know that I used to think, and when I hear young people say this, it just makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up. And that is, so and so is great, but, and then they'll describe the thing about them that's not great. And then they'll say, but I can fix it,
Mm.
right? So, moms and dads, if you're listening and you have a child who's dating someone that you're not crazy about, and you're trying to give your kid some space to sort it out, listen carefully for any indication of, but I can fix it. It's an invitation for you to connect with your child and say, you can't fix anyone,
Mhm.
you know. And even in the best relationships, there's always something about your partner that annoys the crap out of you, right? There's always something that just really annoys you. But in a healthy relationship, it can just be. It's just annoying. But everything else about you I love, and it's all good. I can handle that annoying thing, right? Um, but so helping young people, see the difference between those things. What is
Yeah.
something that you don't love about that person, but you can tolerate it, and something that you don't love about that person that you want to work out of them somehow. Because that is where you're having a boundary violation. Not only
Yeah.
you to them, but them
Mhm.
to you,
Yeah.
both
Yeah.
ways.
Another thing that we talked about that I wanted to explore a little bit is in the book you identify as a lifelong Christian, and I'm just curious what role do you feel like your faith played, but also what was that like? How did you grapple with what was going on with your faith, and can you share more about that?
Sure. I I have been a lifelong Christian. When my parents divorced, my mother went to the Baptist church, my father went to the Presbyterian church. So, I was confirmed and baptized in both churches, but I was very active in my one youth group, my Presbyterian youth group. And those folks, my youth group leaders, they it was the space. So how do I describe this? So my father was always very concerned about how he looked in the world.
Mm,
Um, and so if I was participating in youth group, that made him look good. So that was a piece. So I was able to participate in youth group, but then the leaders in my youth group became safe people
mm,
um, when my home didn't feel safe. So I think it's important to recognize the role that faith communities can play in the lives of young people who may be struggling.
mhm.
So that's one way that um, it's probably not immediately what you were asking, but I think that that's an important piece.
Yeah.
Um, and in the churches that I grew up in, I learned that God was loving and benevolent and wanted the best for us.
Yeah.
Um, I also learned about free will and making choices, and that, God isn't magic. You know, he gave us the gift of free will, and we had to make choices. Um, and we were empowered to make choices. And I think it took me a lot of years of, there's that young childhood faith
Mhm.
um, that is kind of received from the people that we learn from, but it isn't yet integrated.
Mhm.
Um, and as I got older, I experienced, when things were really dark or scary for me, I always felt a gentle presence somewhere in my life and in my being. And so I considered that to be the spirit, you know, gently nudging me towards something that wasn't clear or well understood. And I'm grateful that I had that sense and
Mhm.
felt guided by that, even when things were scary. So that was always present for me. Um, the older I got and the more I would say that my faith came into my healing journey even more in the later stages of my journey when I was really wrestling with what is forgiveness.
Mm.
And for me, um, I didn't wrestle with forgiveness of my ex-husband as much as I wrestled with forgiveness of my father. And I had a very childlike understanding of forgiveness, and I believed that the people who harmed me were never going to repent, right? They were never going to fall on their knees and beg me to forgive them. They were never going to acknowledge or take responsibility for what they did. And so I didn't I didn't feel like I needed to forgive. Um, I certainly knew that Jesus told us to forgive and to forgive 7 times 70, right? There's
Yeah.
so many, forgiveness is so prominent in the gospel and it's so difficult. It's so, so difficult. I ended up, when I was wrestling with forgiveness kept coming up for me in therapy and in other places in my life. Maybe it's time to forgive. Um, and I reached out to a junior pastor in our church, and I needed help. I said, I don't, I'm still not convinced that I'm going to do this, but if it's gonna happen, it's gonna take God because I can't do this myself.
Hmm.
Um, and I went very honestly to the younger pastor. I was an adult at this point. I already had my own children, but I went to this young pastor who was probably 10 years younger than me on purpose because the senior pastor in my church reminded me too much of my father. And I knew that I would kind of surrender myself to him, you know, because this pastor was very much my father's contemporary. So I needed to be able to have conversations about my faith with a younger pastor so that I could stay in myself and not lose myself uh, in that relationship. And he was incredibly helpful to me. Um, I felt this profound guilt and shame about not honoring my father. I couldn't honor my father at that stage of my life. And he helped me through that with scripture. Um, and scripture was I did a lot of reading at that stage when I was really struggling to think and navigate what forgiveness could be for me. And what did God even want? Like what was he actually telling us
Hmm.
when he was telling us to forgive? Because I really just couldn't get my head around that. And I had a really profound faith experience on Pentecost Sunday in 2008.
Okay.
I was literally sitting in church, and for months leading up to that, I was sobbing in church every Sunday. Like I just could not get myself together. It was always the music, not so much the word, but the music would just tug at me. And it on Pentecost Sunday in 2008, I realized that I hadn't cried yet in that service. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. There's been no tears today. And we started to sing a hymn, and I heard the words just absolutely clearly. You were innocent, and so were they.
Mm.
And I was looking around trying to figure out who said that, who's speaking to me. Uh, and I couldn't find a person that it made sense that they said those things to me. And then I heard it again a minute or two later. And, I just knew that it was spirit speaking to me. And that's what I needed to hear to forgive,
Mm.
and forgiveness was as much about forgiving myself for all that I had held on to, all the anger, all the disappointment, the rage, the uh, resentment. Resentment was a very poisonous pill I describe in the book, that I swallowed over and over and over again. Um, and it lifted from me, you know, after hearing those words, and they stay with me. Um, and I think that is part of the reason why I feel compelled to also work with those who offend.
Mhm.
Um, because I always saw my own abuser's brokenness. I
Mm.
could see it.
Yeah.
And to your point earlier about our compassion being used against us, I was compelled to fill a void in the brokenness of another.
Mm.
And um, I did it to my own detriment for a long time, for a long, long time.
Yeah. Wow.
And I honestly, Laurel, I would not be doing the work that I'm doing today. I never could have become the advocate that I am today if I had not had that experience. And my faith was the pathway to that experience. If I had not been able to forgive, I think that my work would be laden with that resentment. It would be laden with anger. And I think when people listen to me talk about violence and abuse and they don't want to push it away, it's because I can do it without those pieces,
Mm. Yeah.
right? I can just be in the presence of it and not be filled with hate and not be filled because you can't meet hate with hate. You're never going to get anywhere. You're never
Yeah.
going to get anywhere. Um, so yeah, that and if I hadn't had faith, I wouldn't be here.
That's so powerful. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Just it really speaks to the healing power when we're open, and how when we can bring those what we feel like are broken, our brokenness, to God, and just how that can transform
Yes.
with
It is
with truth.
transforming is the word. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. It's so fascinating. I don't know if I shared this with you, but in my own coaching practice over the years, I used to be an atheist, so I've experienced different perspectives on God. Um, but I noticed something in the 20 years as a coach, that the clients who were open to God were experiencing so much more transformation than those that shut that part down.
Mm,
It just wasn't there. It was like a door that they kept closed for whatever reason. Like it could be religious trauma, right? For some people, um, not everyone has the fortune of experiencing a church that is doing church right,
right.
right?
Yeah.
There can be
Yeah.
trauma in some churches.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yeah, so that that's really makes sense to me with
Yeah.
your openness and yeah.
It's interesting that you bring that up. In domestic violence work, churches can be very important, but they can also really be painful. So we want to believe that if you're part of a faith community and you disclose that you're being abused by your spouse, that the church is going to get their arms around you and support you. And the message of the church is forgive, forgive, forgive. A lot of the time, what happens is when the church finds out about the violence and abuse, they turn to the abuser and encourage the survivor to just forgive. Like they want to rush to forgiveness. And meanwhile, the survivor has been doing their best to try to forgive over and over, right?
Mhm.
And they can't. And I think forgiveness is a journey. Um,
Mhm.
you know, it can seem simple in a scripture message to forgive and forgive. It's not. That's part of our brokenness as humanity, right? It's hard to
Yeah.
forgive. And I think that people come to forgiveness on their own terms and in their own time. I can tell you for me, it took literally 20 years to come to a place of 20 years, 2 decades, to even invite, to even have the willingness to forgive.
Mm.
20 years. Um, and if I had had that experience in a church, so when that happens, when everybody turns then and says, "Oh, this poor offender, let's forgive them and they're going to get better because we forgive them." Then they just manipulate that system,
Mm.
you know, because they haven't repented. They haven't come to a place of their own reckoning, and that's part of forgiveness. So, so then the person who's been actually harmed in the relationship will often find themselves without a faith community, or they have to go to another church to find a home.
Yeah.
And and they have to forever be known as someone separate from that partner. Because if they're
Mm.
known as part of that relationship, the church doesn't know what to do with it.
Mm.
So it's not every church, but it's
Yeah.
many churches.
Yeah.
And it comes again, it comes from a beautiful place, right? It does come from a beautiful place, but it's misunderstood. It's misunderstood.
That makes sense. And it's almost like stepping in, trying to do God's work for God instead of just hand it over to God, right? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point. So, and I do find that some of the folks that I have worked with over the years, the organization that I took over originally was called Safe Journey,
Hmm.
and it was an outreach ministry of 13 churches in our community.
Okay.
Um, and so we, as an organization, were always called to this work by the Spirit. You know, even after we merged with another organization, took on a new name, it was about feeling called to the work.
Yeah.
Um, but we never proselytized in the work. So I think it can be really damaging to hit people over the head with the Bible. Like if they're ready and that they find comfort and their faith connection supports their healing journey, then I think it is really valuable to make space for that. Um, if that is not part of their journey or it's part of a wound, to require them to do it can be damaging.
Yeah.
So, and those women who come from profound faith and find themselves living with a partner that is abusive and violent, they can be actually some of the hardest women to support.
Mm.
Women specifically. I can't speak to, I haven't had an experience of working with a profoundly faithful man who's been on the receiving end of violence, but um, they truly can be some of the hardest women to help. There was a remarkable priest in my community who really helped me understand this with the Catholic community.
Mm.
And so I'll share this too. Um, you know, in Catholicism, marriage is a sacrament, and it's a big deal for a devout Catholic woman to decide to end her marriage. Um, and many Catholic women make the mistake of thinking that an abusive or violent partner uh, is that they're committing a sin if they choose to divorce their partner. Um, this priest said to me, "Those women have bad theology."
Mm.
And I was taken aback by it. And I said, "So can you help me understand that?" And he said, "The covenant of marriage was broken the very first
Mm.
time their husband abused them.
Wow.
So if they choose to leave the relationship and divorce the husband, they aren't the ones who broke the covenant. The
Mm.
covenant was broken with the abuse." And I have found that that really connects for people.
Mm.
And it really can be very important for whether they're Catholic or people of faith, period, to hear
Yeah.
that, you know, a loving and benevolent God wants what's best for us, and that is never going to be harmed in our own home.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So true. Ah, so many amazing insights here. Allie, we're almost at time. I could talk to you forever. Yeah, wow. So as we're wrapping up, what message would you have to churches, right? Who are they have the best intentions. Um, Churches, therapists, helpers, those in a position, as you mentioned, the lawmakers that face
Mhm.
this, what message would you have to help them elevate their walk with someone who's experiencing this?
So the single most important thing that anyone in any capacity can do that's trying to help someone who has endured violence and abuse is to invite them to identify what they need.
Hmm.
Um, Even our criminal justice system wants to protect, right? They want to
Mhm.
serve and protect. And so they think when they swoop in, when they're called and try to separate the couple and do what they're going to do, um, it a in that moment, there's physiological reasons that people can't make good decisions in that moment
Mhm.
that
Yep.
need to be recognized. But to start with a question like, what do you need right now?
Mm.
Um, and the right now is really important because I may only be able to think about the next minute and the next minute after that and the next minute after that. And so, and when we invite people into choosing what they need, not choosing how to please you, the person who's doing the asking,
Mm.
um, they are much more inclined to follow through.
Mm.
And with every little step that they take, and they feel some sense of empowerment, they begin to believe that they can do whatever they're aspiring to.
Mm.
Um, and when the systems that want to help swoop in and tell a survivor what they need to do, we are doing exactly to them what their partner has done to them the duration of their relationship,
Wow.
right?
Yeah.
We're telling them that we know better that than they do. We don't. We
Mm.
never do. And their answers may not make sense to us, but if it makes sense to them and they're willing to take action on it, that's where the power is.
Yeah. Wow. My, as my mentor Sandy said, power is an inside job.
Yeah, that's so true.
Yeah.
So true.
Yeah.
Yes.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Allie. Oh, if you have the book
Oh, I
close
do.
by, it's called More Than a
Mm.
Crime. I'll put links to it. You can get it on Amazon. It's a just phenomenal book, and Allie has a phenomenal heart, phenomenal perspective that she's bringing into this work. So, Allie, thank you so much for your time, and I just so appreciate you and the work that you're doing in the world.
Oh, I'm grateful for this opportunity. Thank you so much, Laurel.
You're so welcome. All right. Have a great, beautiful week, everyone. Blessings.